The Lord be with you. Well, welcome back to another installment in our virtual tour of the stained glass windows in Zion Covenant Church's sanctuary. We have been working our way window by window all along that north wall from west to east. And believe it or not, we're not even done with this one wall yet. Zion has a lot of stained glass windows. And stained glass allows the church to tell kind of a pictorial story of the great meta-narrative. And what is interesting artistically is which episodes from the Bible get included in this meta-narrative and how exactly the artists choose to represent them. So I think what we've seen overall up to this point is that humanity was in a harmonious relationship with God in the beginning that was severed because of temptation, because of a serpent, because of forbidden fruit, and humanity's desire to attain godlike knowledge apart from God. So that put us into exile, but the hope that we've been given through the stained glass windows and through the biblical story is that God has not abandoned us or given up on the relationship with humanity, but instead he's bound himself and covenanted himself to us. And we've seen two specific covenants. The covenant with Noah, where God promised not to judge the world and destroy the world through a flood again. So he would preserve the human beings and the animals that exist in the world. And secondly, that God chose Abraham and his descendants to be his people. And God has promised to bless the world through them. But the relationship has been rocky. And even though God had a very personal relationship with Moses as the deliverer of his people, God has tried to extend that same personal relationship with the Israelites through his covenant, his Torah, his teaching and instruction. But unfortunately, just like in the garden, people have grumbled and rebelled and sought after other things. So the last window we looked at, there was this outbreak of poisonous snakes, serpents. And God, again, as he has in the past, has promised to not abandon his people, to not fully give them over to their sin. So God made a way of healing and salvation through allowing Moses to fashion a serpent of bronze held up on a pole, that anyone who would look to that serpent, that image, would live. So this was an act of faith. And kind of the question we left off in that window was, so now that we have this pattern of humanity walking away from God, breaking relationship with God, but continuing to come back, and God providing space and hope and healing for all of the sin and damage that humanity does, what is leadership going to look like after the days of Moses? Because Moses is not going to enter the land of promise. And that's where this next stained glass window comes in. It actually skips over top of a lot of the successors in leadership to Moses. There's nothing about Joshua. There's nothing about the judges. There's nothing about Saul as the first king of Israel. Instead, the window jumps to David, the first good king, if you will, of Israel, and how he was a man after God's own heart. So all of these stained glass images have kind of a key verse or a partial verse associated with them. This particular stained glass window has Psalm 96, verse 1, which is, sing unto the Lord, really Yahweh, the divine name there. Sing unto the Lord a new song, which might seem like an odd verse for a window speaking about David, but what we'll see is it beautifully integrates really in just one window, one piece of artwork, some of the major themes and the major narrative arc of David's life and David's story. So again, I'm going to talk about this image kind of in thirds. We've kind of gotten in the habit of working from the bottom to the top in the image. This time I want to start from the top and work our way down towards the bottom. So immediately, what you'll see in this particular stained glass image is a star. Now, we have encountered stars before, but more often than not, they've been five-sided, rather traditional-looking stars. We mentioned in, I believe it was the window associated with the commandments, the 10 words, the Torah, that now all of a sudden the imagery for God has this star in it, but it was a six-pointed star, which I couldn't help but wonder if this was foreshadowing the next star in the series, in the stained glass series, which is in this particular window. Now we have a six-sided star, but it is specifically the Star of David, and we understand why. David is that chosen king. So we have a star refashioned from the traditional stars into a more traditional Star of David. And again, it has beams emanating from it on the left and on the right. We've seen beams coming out of the stars in a lot of the different stained glass windows, but these particular beams are very, very unique because what you find in the middle of them is what looks like musical rests. Now keep that in mind. That is going to tie into the things when we get to the bottom of the window, especially the verse, which is sing unto the Lord a new song. So we have this musical verse, and now we have what appears to be some musical imagery emanating from the star itself. When you move into that middle third of the window, what you find is this predominant image of a red castle, or maybe what we might think of as a palace. Clearly, this represents the monarchy. David is the first king to set up the capital city in Jerusalem. He is the one to establish his throne. He is actually the first king that God covenants with. So again, we have another covenantal window. The image of the red castle, the monarchy, the kingdom, is sort of divided. In the middle, it is overshadowed by a large harp. Again, another imagery of music. And that sort of moves us into the lower third of the image. We have this sheet music, kind of like a scroll, which wraps around the bottom of the window. The harp sort of sets in the center. The harp is sort of the entryway into the kingdom. And the scroll, the musical sheet, has musical notes all over it. So now you've got musical rests coming out of the beams in the Star of David. You've got the scroll, the sheet music with musical notes underneath it. And then that bottom image kind of centering it is the crown. Again, for kingship, for monarchy, God has decided that leadership is not just going to be a prophet, it's not just going to be a deliverer, but permanent, stable leadership, according to this covenant, is going to come through a king. So again, each of these windows is sort of setting up the story, where we've come from, where we're going, and sort of what makes this unique. Now, when I think of monarchy, when I think of kingdom, song is not the first thing I think of. So using Psalm 96:1 as the key verse might seem a little unusual here, but what I think the beauty is again, David's life is more than just his warrior heart and his military victories. He certainly had those. That's what established the kingdom and the monarchy itself. But what made David a man after God's own heart was he was also a poet. He also spoke words of prophecy. He also sometimes did priestly things as part of his worship of God and his desire to be in an intimate relationship with God. So when we think of God's kingdom, which again, Jerusalem, Israel, is just sort of a microcosm of the kingdom come on earth. It is more than just war and victory and expansive boundaries. It is about song and rejoicing and worship of the one true King. It gets us closer to that garden experience that people were exiled from. One of the questions that maybe we are left with by the end of this window is, will David's kingdom last? Again, if we know that Saul was the first king chosen, it's not represented in the stained glass, but the narrative tells us that, and he wasn't allowed to have a full monarchy. His kingdom ended with him. What sort of promise, what sort of future does David and David's descendants have? And if there is a promise and there is hope for the next generation, for an actual kingship and monarchy and descendants to sit upon the throne and to rule on behalf of God over his people, what will make David's descendants different from him, for better or for worse? And to get the answer to that, we're going to have to wait for the next stained glass window. So until then, in these days of ongoing pandemic and ongoing virtual tours, may the peace of God be with you. Amen.